Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a writing coach, a manuscript editor, a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and a novelist. And you're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with Ariele Sieling. There she is. She writes sci-fi. She teaches people how to write. She's a fascinating person, and so let's just get right into it. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. This is
I'm
exciting.
you're welcome, and it's exciting for me too. We've actually known each other longer than we've known each other, because as writers, we're on the circuit at different writing conferences and places like that. And I think we first came across each other maybe 2 years ago at the Beta Ocean Writers Conference, I believe,
I think
in
so.
the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and then we were co-presenters at the Claggett Center in rural Maryland at a writing retreat. And then a week later, we had a chance to hang out at the Beta Ocean Conference again. I believe
Yep.
that's where it was.
Yep.
And so then we have had a couple of in-depth conversations, which prompted this. So tell me a little bit about how you became a full-time writer.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of have the same story as most writers do. I've been writing since I was a little kid and always interested in that kind of thing. But I never really considered publishing because I didn't really like the traditional method, where you shop your work around to agents and then they shop it around to editors. So I didn't really consider it until I joined a writers group in New Hampshire back when I was living there. And several of the members in the group had already delved into indie publishing. And this is pretty early. Indie publishing is only 15 years old, maybe at the most. And so they were pretty early on. And when they told me about the process, I was immediately in love. And so I started writing and I started publishing. And I just loved the whole thing. So I published my first few books. They were kind of my practice books. And then I quit my job to do freelance. And I decided I was slowly gonna go from freelancing into writing full time. So
And what
here we
was the
are.
job? What was the job you quit?
So my it was copywriting for a timeshare resale company. It was
So
a
you
really
were writing. So you were writing fiction right from the very beginning,
right.
right?
It was a very unpleasant job, so I was looking for an escape.
Okay. And so you self-published, correct?
Yep. Yep.
And what's that like? Because obviously self-publishing and indie publishing has changed drastically over the years, and you seem to have mastered it. And what were some of the things that you learned about the process?
Yeah, so indie publishing has a very high learning curve. It's not just about learning to write a book. It's also, there's a ton of technical stuff involved, right? You have to learn about design, you have to learn about ebooks, you have to learn about formats, you have to learn about distribution, you have to do a lot of your own marketing. All of the stuff that traditional companies do for traditionally published authors, you have to learn how to do it, you have to be willing to do it, and you do have to master it eventually. So I think at the beginning, I didn't really realize quite what I was getting into. It sounded simple enough. But as it turns out, I actually love, now that I know how to do it, I love the whole process. I don't just love writing. I also love the publishing process. I love the design process. And believe it or not, I also actually love marketing. I think it's like a really interesting intellectual challenge. So I'm at the point where I'm happy with my job and all of the different elements of it.
Well, and the interesting thing is, you're an introvert,
Mhm.
and which surprises me because you talk to me, and obviously you're very comfortable in front of the camera, and even though this is live and anything can happen, um, so is there a? I want to discuss that a little bit because writers, I think, in many cases do tend to be shy and or introverted. In fact, let me ask it this way: is there a difference, if so, what is it between being shy and being introverted? Are you both?
No, I am definitely introverted, but I'm not really shy. I didn't realize that though. Like as a teenager, I thought I was shy because I didn't nobody ever told me that there was a difference. And it's something I've obviously had to learn as an adult. But the main difference is, as an introvert, being around other people drains my energy, as opposed to like an extrovert. Like my spouse is an extrovert, and when he goes around other people, he comes out of it like hyped up and like so excited and feeling good. And I'm like, I need to go to bed and be alone for like the next 3 days. But that doesn't mean I'm shy. I'm perfectly comfortable engaging with people and talking to people, particularly when I find people who I think are interesting and who have things in common with me. I might come across as shy sometimes, because if I'm in a situation where I have nothing in common with other people, I tend to just not bother, because it requires so much effort and energy for me to engage with people. To do so for an extended period of time, it's just very exhausting if I'm not getting anything out of it.
So how does your temperament relate to the way you market?
So I have focused most of my marketing around non-other human being things. So
Explain that.
one of the main ways that people market and that they think about marketing is having a lot of one-on-one connections. They either connect with other writers, they might go out and do events where they're like talking to people face to face, book signings, presenting workshops, all that type of stuff. And they make that like the core of their marketing strategy and their marketing efforts. That stuff is just kind of extra side stuff that I do for fun or because I feel like it. The core of my marketing is actually doing like paid advertising online, and other things that I've kind of picked and chosen very selectively based on what I'm comfortable with and based on what's least likely to drain my energy. Because my energy is drained, I can't write,
Exactly. Was the fact that you were going to have to market your writing, was that a surprise? Or did you know right away that that was part of it?
Yeah, I knew. What I didn't know was how much work it
It's a
was.
time suck. It's a major
Yeah,
time suck, right?
yeah. And you kind of have to learn as you go. You figure out what works and what doesn't work, and what works for you or what works for someone else might not work for you. And so like I said, there's just a high learning curve.
It's a lot of trial and error, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about what you've written. And this is where I get intimidated, because look at all those frickin' books. Tell us what you write.
Sure. So I mostly write science fiction and fantasy. What's not shown on this image is I do have a kids book series from like way, 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 way back when I was first beginning, but that's not really part of my brand. So I don't really market it anymore. It's just there. It just exists. So the first line right there is the Land of Sojourner series. It's post-apocalypse with monsters. This was a big deal for me when I first wrote it. It was kind of like shortly after I came through this like breakthrough in figuring out how to actually structure a story effectively. And I'm very proud of that series. I really enjoyed writing it. The second line there, that's my Rove City series. Rove City is a series of fairy tale retellings all set in space. I have always been interested in fairy tale retellings, and so I had been thinking for a long time, like, how would I approach fairy tale retellings? Because most of them are still set in sort of a medieval fantasy style world. And I just thought it'd be really interesting to take all of your, famous fairy tale characters like Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast and just stick them on a spaceship somewhere. I just thought it was funny.
And it's public domain, right?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
And then
the next line, that was actually my very first series of
which line are we on now?
The third one.
This one here. Okay.
That starts with Wagered Whims and Sundry Sky.
Of course it does.
So this is actually when I originally started this series, the title was the Sagitan Chronicles. And I picked the title off of old National Geographic star map that I had. And I spent the next 5 years fielding people who wanted to know if I'd written books about astrology. And so just this year in January, I completely rebranded and redesigned the whole thing. It's now called the Zirian Chronicles. I updated, I did edits, I completely redesigned. It's got brand new covers. The interior is brand new. The stories are the same, but I did some like more experience editing on them. So they're kind of a new thing, but they're also an old thing.
Wow. And then the next line.
Aria, Fugue, and Opus are a trilogy, future fantasy. So it's fantasy, but it's kind of set in a futuristic world. This was also the thesis for my fake master's degree program.
What do you mean?
I didn't want to pay for a master's degree, so I developed a curriculum for myself, followed through on it. And then the last thing that I did when I graduated last September was publish this trilogy.
And you saved yourself $1 gazillion in the process.
I sure did. And then next to it is my new Ariel's fairy tales, I'm calling them. I kind of got tired of working with the original fairy tales, and a lot of the original fairy tales don't represent modern values or what I consider to be modern values. So I've started writing new fairy tales, and these are just collections.
Mhm.
And then the last line is my nonfiction series for authors. I just released How to Pants a Novel like 2 weeks ago. So that one's brand new.
Interesting. Let's go back just for a quick second about the new fairy tales, because some of those themes were sexist, racist, and so on. So which are the issues that you feel most urgently that need retelling?
I'm really interested in things like identity and being allowed to be who you are, self-actualization, figuring out your own philosophy, your own ideology, those types of ideas. So a lot of the characters in those fairy tales are stuck in these worlds. They don't have control over the world, but they do have control over how they respond to the world and their own attitudes and their own beliefs. And so the idea is most of them are trying to figure out how to come to terms with what they actually believe in comparison with the world around them.
Okay, so let's go back and so these then, if I understand correctly, are the first in each series. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, so Tentacles and Teeth is book 1 in the Land of Sojournek. Aria is the first in Aria's Song. Midnight Wings is the first in the Rove City series. Sundered Sky is the first. It used to be called Wounded World, if anybody's watching who's been around for a while. How to Build a Book Marketing Strategy. And then the last one there is Coming Soon. That's going to be another future fantasy series that's hopefully going to be pretty long.
Oh my goodness. So looking at all of those, how long ago did the first one come out? The very first of everything.
So the very, very, very first, all the way back to the beginning from the original series there, came out in March of 2013.
Good Lord. So you're a machine. Let's just establish that from the very beginning. How are you able to write so prolifically and fast?
So I'm a fast writer, just generally. I'm a fast typist. I learned how to type when I was 10. I also have a pretty good system now. One of the things I've learned, especially working as a consultant with other writers, is that when you're working on your first book or your second book, or even like your third, most writers don't actually know what their process is. And so the book takes a lot longer because they're doing so much experimentation and they're really figuring things out. Once you get past a certain point, you kind of figure out what you're doing and you get rid of all of the extraneous experimentation, and you can really focus in on whatever process works the best for you, as opposed to trying what works for everybody else. So what's actually true is that even though the first book was published in 2013, the bulk of those have been published since 2019.
Okay, so you've learned as you've gone.
Yep.
And at what point did you decide to add to that teaching? And how did that come about?
I actually started really early. I now question the wisdom of doing that.
Why?
Just because I was really young, but you know what? You got to learn by doing stuff. So I actually started teaching at the beginning because I was like, well, I'm going to be an author. I get really nervous public speaking. The best way to get over the nerves is to do it. So after publishing my third book, a couple of friends of mine and I, who all three of us had self-published, decided to try giving a workshop at a local library on just like the general process of how to create a published book. And it turned out that I loved the teaching. So I did a bunch of stuff with them, and then eventually they like went off and did their own stuff, and I just kind of kept going, and here I am, 8, 9 years later, having done a lot of teaching.
Okay. So we should talk about your most recent book. And as I'm trying to find it here to bring up on the screen, uh, talk about how you get your ideas. And let's bring up Aria. That's the
Yes.
current. That's your most recent one.
That's the
So
most recent, the one that I'm focusing on promoting. I
okay.
because it's the first book in the trilogy. So I've also published those two. I've published another fairy tale book. I've published another Rove City book. So anyway, it's not technically the most recent, just to be
Just
accurate.
yeah, you got the journalist's heart there as
I know.
well, and
I can't. I
correcting
can't
the
help
record.
it.
Tell
But
us
it's
about Aria.
yeah. So um, this was a kind of an interesting. This came from kind of an interesting place. So I am an idea machine. Like I do not have to put any effort into coming up with ideas. If you ask me to brainstorm, give me a list of 10, fill in the blank, I would be able to pretty much do it instantaneously. It's just kind of how my brain works.
Hmm.
But this book came about because 2019, so this is even before 2020,
Mhm.
2019 was a really rough year for me. I had 10 people in my life, some very, very close to me and some a little bit further away, die just within like a 12-month period.
Dear me.
And it was just really, really rough. And so I was obviously very stressed. I was very overwhelmed. I was having trouble writing. I had, client work that I was trying to juggle. I was trying to publish, and I kept having to travel because I was going to all these funerals. And, grief is a very complicated thing, especially when you start layering it.
Right.
And so I decided around August, after my mentor and my cat both died within a month of each other.
Dear me.
So I decided I needed something that didn't matter. I decided I needed something, a project to work on that didn't have an audience, that there were no expectations, that I could just do for my own edification and for the joy of writing. Because I felt like all of my writing at that point was either for clients or trying to finish the next book in this series to make money or whatever.
Mhm.
And so one day I just sat down. I didn't plan anything out ahead of time. I didn't think I had a dream about 2 weeks before of just this weird image of like a little girl in a red coat sitting on a train going through like a really tight forested tunnel. And so with that image in my head, I just started writing. And it was really cool because it just came out. Like it was the easiest book I've ever written. The whole thing just like poured out of me. And it didn't pour out of me perfectly. Like I definitely went back and added depth and added layers and did a lot of editing and whatnot. But it was like a very, very cool experience. I think it's the kind of experience people talk about when they talk about the muse, or they talk about some sort of like magical or like God-like or whatever inspiration, being struck by inspiration. That kind of felt like that for me.
Mhm.
So it was supposed to be a standalone, but I don't really do standalones very well. So I just like drafted the whole thing, even on top of all of my other projects. I had it done by the end of the year. And then it's 85,000 words. And then I just rolled right into the next book. I didn't even like pause for a breath. And by the end of 2020, which obviously my whole life went upside down all over again in 2020.
Sure, everybody's did. Yeah.
Exactly. I had I had three total books done in the trilogy. And I was midway through my fake master's degree, and I was like, you know what, this is the perfect project to be my thesis. I'll do all my own design. I'll do all my own editing. I'll do all my own everything, and try to take all the stuff that I've learned and apply it to this trilogy.
So how would you summarize Aria in a couple of sentences? Aha.
I'm good at this by now, but I'm not. It's a future fantasy, so it follows a lot of same fantasy tropes about a young woman living in a kind of futuristic city with androids. She works at a tavern. She has a weird past that she tries not to think about too much because she gets really bad migraines when she tries to think too much about the past. And then she has this weird side effect where if she comes too close to electronic equipment, it dies. And so, right early on the beginning of the book, she has a tendency to run into androids, and the androids die because they're electronic machines.
Mhm.
So, right at the beginning, she's working at this tavern, and a guy comes in looking for an android murderer. And she's like, "Uh oh, like, I hope that's not me."
Yeah.
And so that kind of incites this whole story. She goes on the run, and it becomes this kind of like back and forth. It's got an unreliable narrator and sort of very light romantic subplot that kind of goes through all three books.
Okay. So there are a couple of things I want to get to. One is since we're talking about sci-fi fantasy, I've edited some of those, but that's not, not my comfort zone.
Mhm.
But what I've discovered, and tell me if I'm on the right track, what really is if what makes an effective sci-fi or fantasy story, especially if you're creating new worlds, is you still need to make it relatable to the
Mhm.
here and now. And the best way to do that is, in addition to effectively building a new world, to make the relationships and the characters authentic and relatable. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I totally agree. You can give somebody a new world, but unless they have some sort of context for understanding that world, then it doesn't really mean anything. So having a character who makes sense and who you can kind of get along with, who you're clearly seeing through their eyes. I mean, that's how we learn as human beings anyway. You're born and you see everything through your parents' eyes, at least for the first few years. And it's the same thing for your reader. They're seeing everything through that character's eyes. And so it has to be clear, it has to be understandable. It can't be relatable to everybody, but you want
Sure.
it to be, when you tie in, that's one of the reasons I decided to do a romantic subplot. When you tie in emotional experiences that real people have and you give those emotional experiences to your characters, it's the emotional experiences that people connect with more than anything else.
Got it. Do you do any editing?
I do developmental editing, so only like high level macro stuff, not copy editing or proofreading.
Okay, and based on that experience, what are
Mhm.
some of the common mistakes that people make when they're creating these kinds of stories?
I think some writers get too invested in their world, and it can make it
What do you mean?
like they'll do tons and tons and tons of world building, and they'll put all of that detail into the story, and it can be distracting. It can be hard because you're kind of as the reader, you're learning a brand new world in addition to learning the story. It'd be like if somebody picked you up and dumped you in the middle of China. You don't understand the language, you don't understand the culture, you don't even recognize the varieties of trees that are around you. And so you have to have a good character, and you have to give the reader enough time with that character to understand who they are a little bit before you can really start understanding the world through their eyes. So you have things like info dumping. You have, things like using weird named things that don't have any connection. These are all kind of the same. I don't want to call it mistake because some writers do it purposefully, but it can be isolating for the reader if there's too much of that type of thing, like too much world.
Do you get any blowback from people you're editing and you point these things out and they go, "Well, you obviously don't know what you're talking about."
I don't know. I try not to engage with my clients too much about their project after they send it to me. I give them the feedback that I think is appropriate. I send them back to them and they can take it or leave it. That's kind of my approach. You don't have to do what I say. It's
Do they pay you up front?
I take 30% upfront
Oh my.
and the
You
rest after the fact. Yeah.
Well, if you get the rest after the fact, then that is an indication that they're probably okay with it, because the thing I worry about is that somebody's going to say, "Oh, that's not a good investment of my money,
Mhm.
so I'm not going to pay you." I get them to pay. I hold the manuscript hostage
Until they
before.
pay you.
Oh, hell yeah!
I send
And
it, but I use PayPal. So if we have a conflict, I can complain to PayPal and they will do the legwork for me to get the money.
oh, they have their ways.
Mhm.
Talk about seat of the pants writing. You mentioned that your most recent nonfiction is on pantsing, which is,
Mhm.
just letting it rip. And how does that work? How does that feel? How would you describe that process? We all know what plotting is and planning, but that
Mhm.
seat of the pants writing has always felt to me as if it's spinning your wheels.
Yeah. So I think for some people it is spinning your wheels. I definitely think different people have different brains, and so what's going to work for them in terms of generating that story is obviously different. The way I think about it is, from the outside, it might look a little bit like I'm just sitting down at the computer or whatever and just writing. But there's a lot more gears that are kind of going on in my brain, not just during the writing process, but all the time. So I go a little bit more into detail about this in the book itself, but I kind of think of my brain as having three separate parts. One part is what I call the gatherer, who is just constantly collecting information. And I have this giant pool in my brain, and that's where all ideas come from. Not just like the high level ideas for a story, but as I'm writing, picking the color of a character's shirt or, describing the little details of the world as they're seeing it around them. All of that stuff comes out of this giant tub of information that I've been collecting. I also have the writer, or who I also call the wanderer, because I like to think of it. I like the metaphor of kind of like wandering through a field of ideas and picking the ones that I want. Um, and that is the writer who's actually picking and choosing the ideas and then putting them on the page. And then I have a third piece of my brain I call the observer, who's kind of like the critical voice. You've probably heard other writers talk about the critical voice, but I try to keep it neutral. Sometimes it can become the critical voice, sometimes it can become an internal cheerleader, but I try to keep it neutral to watch the story as it's being told. It kind of pays attention to all of those little details, and then as we move through the story, if the like writer part tries to go off track, the observer can be like, oh, hey, remember this? Like, don't go that direction. And I've been practicing this obviously for quite a while now, and I've gotten pretty good at it. I think it's partially just kind of it's almost meditative. It's like letting go of your thoughts and just like letting them go and understand the story and watch the story as it's being written. It's a very subconscious process.
Well, I want to talk about that because one of my students in a class that I'm teaching now is having trouble doing that.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to help her, sort of break the logjam. And one of the things that I've tried with her, and I'll be interested to see if I might be on the right track, is that I've noticed in myself that I'm very left brain oriented. I'm a just
Mhm.
the facts, planning and analytical kind of person. So getting out of my own head is a hard thing to do. And yet I have learned at least a little bit about seat of the pants writing in the sense that you're just writing and you're turning off, the left side, the analytical side, and without judgment, just letting things flow, trying to stir up your subconscious by asking questions, what if questions, and
Mhm.
then or interviewing a character and asking them, who are you and why do you want to be in my book? And then listening to the voice and transcribing it. So I guess my question to you is, what's the best way for a person who's primarily left-brained analytical to be able to tap into that right brain creative?
I would say, this goes back to a theme of mine, but I think experimentation is really important. So, like, there's different, if you read books about like plotting and outlining and stuff, there's like a very lot of different ways that people approach the process of creating a story. Um, and you can have authors who literally have like Excel spreadsheets and like detail like every single scene of every single book, and in this just like excruciating detail, versus somebody like me who plans out absolutely nothing ahead of time and I just write stuff and hope it turns out okay. But there's so much room in the middle. And usually, if I'm working with somebody who is a pantser primarily, but is really struggling, I will suggest that they take a step back. And there's two things that I usually recommend. Either I call it back plotting what they've already written so far. So basically, sit down as if you were writing an outline and pull out the key pieces of the story. It might be the normal world, it might be the inciting incident, it might be rising action, pick out whatever based on whatever plot structure you're using or you're familiar with, and see where you've come so far. Because sometimes that simple process can help you figure out where you're going, and it can kind of break that logjam. And then the other thing I sometimes recommend is kind of doing the same thing, but just creating a really, really high level, really loose outline. Not one of those, super detailed step, but just kind of, for a lot of people, just knowing where they're going, having like a singular point to work towards or a series of goalposts kind of can really help them move through those like really the murky middle, the difficult part.
The muddled middle.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay. Well, and it's obviously it works for you.
Mhm.
And I think that's really good advice. And I think you're the first person I've talked to who has analyzed in detail how that seat of the pants approach can work and work effectively. So that's very helpful. And I'm probably going to share the link of our interview with my class because I
Yeah.
think you're doing a much better job than I can on getting this across. So thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
One thing I'd like to explore is this whole idea of chat GPT, which is artificial intelligence as a way of creating stories. It's very controversial, and you've done some thinking about that. So let's talk first just in terms of what is it
Mhm.
and how do you feel about it?
I love artificial intelligence, and I will just come out on the record and say that. I think it's really cool. I'm a very, I guess, sort of future thinker. I think AI is the future. It's already here. Most people have been using AI in their everyday lives, and they don't even know it. It's in your smart TV. It's in your GPS. It's in the software that we're using right now. It's all over the place. There's a lot of different types of AI. There's different ways that it works. One of the things I struggle with, and I'm working really hard on this. I'm actually Hank Green's crash course. He has one on AI, so I'm working really hard to learn actually how it works. But one of the things that you run into is everybody has opinions about AI and how it works, but nobody actually knows how it works. And
Hmm.
that's because it's really complicated. We're talking advanced computing, we're talking advanced mathematics, and everybody wants a yes or no answer. Like, oh, it's moral or it's immoral, right? It's legal or it's illegal. It's good or it's bad. But you just can't have that with something so complicated as artificial intelligence. It's good in some cases, it's bad in some cases. In some instances, the way it's developed and created is moral and legal, and in some cases, it's not. You're talking about companies with software. That's all proprietary information. They don't have to tell you anything that they don't want to tell you unless Congress gets involved, which seems unlikely at this juncture. So it's just going to keep developing and keep growing and keep changing. And I think the best thing that, if you're interested in it, is that you can do is just pay attention, explore it, learn it, use it in ways that you feel comfortable using it, and don't use it if you don't feel comfortable using it, but just, kind of pay attention and learn.
Have you been using it?
Hmm. Yep.
How have you been using it, and how does that impinge on your own creativity?
So I look at it as a tool, sort of similar to the way that I might use thesaurus.com, or I might use Google, or I might use stock photos from a stock photo site. I use all of these things for inspiration at various points during my process. So, for example, let's say I'm writing a scene and it's in a weird looking building. I might go onto Google and look up weird looking buildings that, with whatever parameters I'm trying to find, and then I'll use that image to describe it. Well, now instead of going to Google, I might instead go to Midjourney, type in a description of the building that I want to see, and let Midjourney generate an image for me. And then I can use that on social media if I want to, or I can just use it to as like a foundational image to describe the scene that I'm trying to describe.
Now, Midjourney, what's Midjourney?
Midjourney is an art AI. So you type in a text command, and it will generate an image based off of that text command. And they're
And how
really good.
and because I dipped into briefly chat GPT,
Yep.
and it's complicated, or at
Mhm.
least it seems complicated to me.
Yeah.
Uh, and it
It's
made me feel as if I would be giving up my creativity. But you've also played
Yep.
around with that.
I think the important thing to realize about ChatGPT is that it is going to produce about as generic of writing as anything. Like, it's trained on the internet, right? And the internet is full of the most boring, generic type of copy
Mhm.
that exists. So you can absolutely, say, "Hey, Chat GPT, write me a description of, a field in the setting sun." And it's going to write you a description of the field in the setting sun, but it's not going to write you a description of the field in the setting sun in the voice of your character. Even if you feed content into it, like, here's an example of what I want, it can't do it. It can't do it. Usually what I use it for, though, is to give me ideas. So one of the things I struggle with a lot is naming things. So, like, let's say I want to name a character and I have a particular theme in my mind. You can go onto naming sites and look up, give me a list of names that mean a specific thing. But with ChatGPT, you could say, ChatGPT, give me a list of names that mean light, bright, or anything to do with light and light refraction. And it will give you like a much, much wider range of things than you would get from just searching specific name meanings on like a baby name site.
Mhm. It sounds like it's almost, in that case, it almost is like a thesaurus.
Yeah, and I use it for that too, because sometimes you go into the thesaurus and you're like, "I know I need a word that kind of means this and it kind of means that," and you end up on the thesaurus for like 45 minutes trying to find that one word that you know exists
Well, speak for
where
yourself. Um,
uh, yeah.
Anything else you want to add about artificial intelligence in writing?
I think the only thing I would add is that we don't have to worry about it as much as everybody thinks right now. I
Why
think
not? Why
I
not?
I think that, we're gonna it's just like any new technology. I think people are going to find unique and creative ways to use it that are both bad and good. I think we're going to implement social rules. I think we're going to implement actual legal rules. I think the black box technology is going to be unblack boxed sooner rather than later. I think it's going to provide some really good things. It already does some really great things for us, like with GPS and accessibility for different things like captions, generating captions and stuff like that. That's all AI. And I think the best thing about human beings is that they are able to pivot, and we will find ways to use AI as a tool. It's not going to come in and take over our creative lives.
So you say. We'll have to come
So I
back
say,
and we'll
we'll
have
find
to
out.
revisit this. I want to turn to something that's near and dear to your heart. Um, you are on the board of the Appalachian Great Pyrenees Rescue. What's that, and who's that to your right?
So this is Blueberry. He's our dog. I don't know where he is. Sometimes he wanders around when I'm doing these things. We adopted him last year. We had another Great Pyrenees before Blueberry named Octavius. Octavius was very old and he passed away early 2022. I had to think about what year it is. And we got Blueberry a few weeks later. He's 143 pounds,
Good Lord.
very fluffy. He's got a great personality. We got both peers from the Appalachian Great Pyrenees Rescue. Their focus is obviously on this specific dog, this specific breed. Um, this breed in particular has some unique characteristics that make it unlike other dogs. They're bred to be independent. They're bred to guard sheep. And so often they'll get sent out with herds, and their job is to just pay attention, chase off coyotes, chase off wolves. Two full size male Pyrenees dogs can take down a grizzly bear.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
Yep, they're one of the only species or breeds of dog that watch the sky as well. So they'll protect from hawks and eagles and birds of prey as well. But that means that they're very independent, very opinionated. They feel like they know, how things should be done. They cannot be left alone. Like we can't just let him off leash in the yard, or he will just take off, and it doesn't matter. But that means that they're very hard to place because you have to have a very specific type of owner who's willing to work with this very specific type of dog. They're smart. They can
Yeah.
learn commands. They just don't obey them.
And I would imagine that one of the reasons that they need rescuing is that they're expensive.
Yes. They
It
are.
probably costs a lot to feed them.
It does. He eats 4 cups of food a day, plus treats and bones. And if something happens, it's also very expensive. If they get hit by a car, which is very common because they're always running off. There's lots of issues. Plus, they're big. You have to have space for them. Like a lot of apartments and stuff don't allow dogs over 50 pounds. So
Right.
we like
Right.
them.
Okay. Well, I want to, before we go, I want to pivot away from writing and all of that to something that you and I have talked about, but I'm not sure you've talked about this in public before. But I think that it's a very important topic, and we'll just sort of feel our way along because you and I have had a conversation about evangelicalism, which has been certainly front and center politically for, well, probably since the 80s, since the moral majority, when Jerry Falwell started the moral majority. Pat Robertson ran as an evangelical presidential candidate in 1988. So, and I think it even goes back to 1976 when Jimmy Carter ran for president and, referred to himself as a born again. He's a Southern Baptist, or at least a Baptist. So religion has been in the public sphere for a long time, but then the evangelicals started to go for Trump, who, for lack of a better word, is amoral. And so that was kind of a real head snap for me. And, I've got some evangelical experiences as well, but you have chosen to, in a sense, leave the evangelical church. And I'm sure that decision did not come easily. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your thought process and why and how you were able to, make that kind of transition.
Sure. So it probably doesn't surprise you, but I was a pretty smart kid.
It doesn't surprise me.
So I grew up going to church with my family. I'm not sure. Sometimes I wonder if evangelical is even quite the right word, but the way I see it is we went to a lot of different churches with a lot of different ideologies. And the one thing that really defines evangelicalism is they kind of have invented their own ideology that's separate from like a specific. So that's kind of like what I did. I picked and I had all of these different ideas kind of swirling in my brain given to me by other people. And what I ran into very, very early on was so many things that didn't make sense. The funny story that I like to tell is because I was in Sunday school when I was like, I don't know, 14 or 15. And we were doing like the Christian version of like sex ed, right? Where they're like one man for one woman. And I knew that my Sunday school teacher had been divorced prior to becoming a Christian. So I asked him, if it's one man for one woman, how come you're allowed to have sex with your new wife, your second wife? He did not like that question.
And how old were you when you asked that?
Like 14.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. And his answer was basically, well, I'm born again. And I was like, well, that seems like a very convenient loophole. Anytime you want to do anything that's not Christian, you could just quit Christianity, go do it, and then become born again a second and a third and a fourth time, so what's the point of ever having been Christian in the first place? Right. So this sort of thought process inspired me to start doing my own self-study and apologetics. And I started with, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. I read books like My Utmost for His Highest. I read a lot of Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, I forget what all of his series was, but a bunch of those, Watchman Nee, a bunch of.
My goodness, that's pretty deep stuff.
Yeah. So I was just like off the reservation, so to speak. on just so much detail, so much material, whatever I could get my hands on, I was reading about Christianity because I was like, I have to be missing something. And that was kind of the theme of my thought process. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. But everybody around me believes it. All the adults in my life believe it. My friends believe it. My whole community, you know, rural upstate New York, everybody believed this. So I felt like I must be missing something.
Well, was there a point at which you believed it?
Yeah. I mean, but I'm not sure I believed it ever fully. Like, I believed it like 80%, but there was always that voice in my head that was saying, well, you believe this because you're supposed to believe this. But what about this? What about this? Why, you know? And so I asked everybody that I could, as many questions as I could. But because I was female, I often was dismissed, ignored, told that I just needed to have faith. That was a very common.
How do you know that it was because you were female?
Because my older brother went through some similar process. When he was in high school, this is just one example, but when he was in high school, he was allowed to join an adult Bible study so that he could ask those questions and have the more in-depth conversations. I asked to join the adult Bible study and was turned down. And there's just like a pattern of these little things where my brother or my other friends, because I had a bunch of male friends, were allowed to have these conversations. Like, I had one friend who had sit-down meetings with our youth pastor to ask questions, but I was not given that same opportunity. So maybe it was just because nobody liked me, but my assumption is that it was more likely like, no, you're a woman, you have the specific role in the church, and it is not to do the thinking part. So when I went to college, backtrack a little, the semester before college, I decided that one of the big keys that was missing for me was that there were too many Protestant denominations. And I was like, if everybody believes the same thing at the core, right, like the Trinity and being born again, why does everybody hate each other? And this was something that I had experienced over and over again. This church doesn't like that church. This church doesn't like that church. So the Baptists don't like the Wesleyans. The Methodist church doesn't like the Presbyterians. And I was like, it seems like everybody would get a lot more work done if they just all kind of teamed up. So I was like, again, I must be missing something. So a couple of my friends and I decided to do a church hopping expedition the summer after my senior year. And we went to church after church after church. We went to a Jewish temple. We went to like Seventh-day Adventist church. We went to, you know, Presbyterians, Episcopalian, Methodist, Wesleyan, like everything that we could come up with. Nazarene. We did a Nazarene church, which probably a lot of people haven't even heard of. And at the end, I was like, everyone's really nice. Why does everybody hate each other? And I couldn't, it was just like this question that was just getting like bigger and bigger. So I kept at it in college because I was like, well, I'm in college now. People have to take me seriously, right? And so when I was at UNC, at the beginning of every semester, all of the local churches around the college would have these like college student lunches to try to get you, you know, to come. And so it was free food. It was like, I was always about free food. And during the lunch, I would deliberately sit myself next to a pastor or a youth pastor, like the college age pastor. And I would just pick questions that I would ask them. And I didn't really care what their answers were. I cared how they responded to the question. So I would ask them things like, do you think dinosaurs and humans existed at the same time based on scripture, right? Like stuff like that. And 9 times out of 10, they brushed me off, rolled their eyes, told me that, you know, here, go read this book if you really care about that kind of thing. The only person who took me seriously was a Catholic priest from Juneau, Alaska, because at a certain point I just got fed up and I emailed like 25 priests because I was like, the Protestants are full of shit. So I'm going to try the Catholics to see how they feel. And my aunt is Catholic. So she sent me like a catechism, which I read most of, if you can believe that. And so I emailed all of these different priests. Only one of them, well, 3 responded. 2 told me to go to a local Catholic church and ask for help nearby. And one of them answered my questions. And then for the next 2 years, we had an ongoing conversation where I asked him every question that I had in my head, and he would answer it very thoughtfully and very considerately. And I appreciated it so much. Like, it just felt like, okay, finally somebody's taking me seriously. Then he even recommended that I go to get a doctorate in theology. That's how intense my questions were, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
He sent me a bunch of like materials like to learn more about Catholicism. But what I learned from my interaction was that Catholicism wasn't any better than Protestantism. There were just as many questions. They had a more rigid structure, certainly, and they had some more convenient loopholes like confession and things. So you could live a little bit more of a secular liberal lifestyle without feeling like you were going to go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, all of the same problems existed within Catholicism that I felt existed within the Protestant church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So eventually I got to the point where I was just like, okay, let me just like solve every single problem. And I literally wrote down a list of questions I had about Christianity. And I was like, if I was answering this question to somebody who was seeking, what would I say? I answered every single question until I got to the Bible verse about Jesus. I think we talked about this, Jesus cursing the fig tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, there is no explanation for this story. He cursed a fig tree. He did active harm to the farmer.
He cursed the fig tree because it didn't bear fruit, correct?
It didn't bear fruit. He was just in a bad mood one day, and he, and the whole story of Protestantism is that Jesus is without sin, and that's how come when he died on the cross, he was able to take on all of our sins and make us. But I was like, this seems like a sin to me. Like, and the writers of the Bible chose to put this in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, they didn't have to put this story in the Bible. They could have left this moment out if they really wanted me, because I'm sure they were thinking about me years ago. But if they really wanted me to believe, why would they put this in? I even looked up like the original Hebrew. Like, I did everything to see, like, am I missing something? Am I missing something? And that story, I mean, the foundation for me was already shattered, right?
Sure, yeah.
But that one story was kind of like ripping out the keystone and having the whole wall fall down.
What I'm not hearing, though, in your explanation is that, were you praying? Were you in any way seeking divine guidance, or did you not feel that that was an avenue worth pursuing?
I was. I mean, my parents, my mom used to put on our chores list, read Bible and pray. And it was optional. She didn't force it. She just wanted it as a reminder. And so I was very much in the habit. I prayed regularly. At one of the number one questions is I would be like, hey, God, hello, like, can you hear me? Like, I have been asking these questions. I'm doing all this legwork. The least you could do is like, give me some sort of sign, or like, just show up. That would be great. I would have a conversation with you. And nothing. I got nothing.
Yeah. So, at what point was the rupture when you, in a sense, broke away?
It's kind of hard to answer the question because it was a slow. After, it's kind of like that Bible verse, cut the rope that was tying me to the dock. So it was like a slow drift away. But probably once I graduated from college, I moved to New Hampshire, and I didn't have any of my friends. I didn't have any of my community. I didn't have anything. I was just kind of afloat, like, literally. And I finally got to the point where I was just like, I'm definitely like, this is not me. I was in Los Angeles in October visiting a friend of mine and their wife. And we went to the Getty, I think it's called the Getty Center. And we were like looking out over the city of Los Angeles. Right. And I said, hey, can I tell you something? And they were like, anything. And I said, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. And this is like the only person in my life who wasn't a Christian. And they said, okay, that's okay. And from that point forward, it was just kind of like, all right, I've stated it out loud. That means it's real now. And then immediately crashed into like a big depression. And
Well, and I'm sure that, your parents weren't thrilled about that either.
I didn't tell them for about 6 months. It was difficult to tell them. Yeah. And my older brother didn't really care. But it was definitely a challenging conversation to have.
Sure. And let me ask you this. what, based on, obviously you've done a lot of seeking and observing, what in your opinion is the biggest blind spot that evangelicals have?
They see the world from their own perspective and completely dismiss anybody else's perspectives. One of the things that frustrated me the most, particularly in college, was I had learned in high school that seekers were welcome in churches. They would say, invite your friends, we welcome seekers, we'll answer any questions. And I was seeking. And I would go into these spaces and I would try to talk to the pastors. I would try to talk to leaders in the church. I would try to talk to college age, not age, but like what is, they're like youth pastors, but
Yeah,
whatever.
young adults,
Young adult pastors or whatever.
right?
And it was basically every single person except for Father Scott, every single person just dismissed me. And so I felt like I was asking these seeking questions, and I was in this position where I was supposed to be welcomed, and I was supposed to be being shown compassion and empathy and kindness, right? And especially because you hear these big fancy stories where people like their testimony where they're like, oh, I was in prison and then God changed my life and now I'm, and I was like, I'm in that space of that like significant ideological shift, but no one will listen to me, no one will talk to me. And it was like I was alone, like completely alone, and it didn't matter where I went or who I tried to talk to, I was completely alone.
What it sounds like is that the evangelicals that you were contacting and in contact with were more wrapped up in their doctrine than they were
Mhm.
in you as a person.
Yes. And one of the things I tell my brother, my older brother is still Christian. One of the things that I tell him when he asks me for feedback is that evangelical Christianity is, in my experience and from my perspective, very self centered. It's about my relationship with God. It's about me being as holy as possible. It's about me seeking perfection. It's always about me first. And I, I hate that.
Right.
But it's very isolating. Like if you're evangelical, your whole point is to be evangelizing and reaching out and engaging with the community. But it's so centered, self-centered, and they make these little bubbles, in the world, but not of it bubbles where it's
Mhm.
just us against the world. And I
Sure.
think you see that in politics. It's they feel persecuted because they've created this bubble and
Right.
they're like, this ideology is real, this is right. And anybody who thinks differently is evil, sinful, has been like their brain has been attacked by the devil, like you know what I mean, like, and this is like really intense language around it, like just it's
Exactly. So where would you say you are now spiritually, if anywhere spiritually?
I tend to avoid the word spiritual in any capacity. I'm a
Okay.
writer spiritually. No,
Okay.
no, I'm agnostic, and I have toyed with atheism, but my problem with atheism, I will say that I'm atheist because I'm a lot closer to atheist than I am to anything else.
Mhm.
But my problem with atheism is it requires just as much faith as a religion does, and I'm basically anti-faith. I don't. It's an impossible philosophical conundrum. Don't worry, I know I've been down the path, but the best way that I can define it and explain it is that I am against faith without evidence.
Well, but if you get on an airplane, that's an act of faith, isn't it?
It is, but I can also learn the math, study the gravity, I can do the experiments, and I can find evidence. So that's what
Okay.
I'm saying. It's an impossible philosophical conundrum, but I
Okay.
try to stay as far away from faith as I can get.
Interesting. Fascinating. You've just confirmed why I like talking with you. You're a very interesting person. Um, let's talk. Thank you for talking about this because I know that this is certainly a personal topic for you, but it seems to me an important thing. I mean, I have a lot of Christian friends, and some of them may be watching and listening, and so I'm hoping that there are some takeaways that they can pick up from what you've had to say. What's next for you? Are you, yeah, I can't imagine that you're not working on something, probably several projects all at once. So what's coming up next?
Well, tomorrow I'm giving a workshop at the Maryland Writers Association. um, so that'll be fun.
Okay.
And
But I'm
then
talking about your writing. What are you writing?
So April is National Novel Writing Month, the camp version. So my goal is to write at least one book in April, maybe one and a half. We'll kind of see how productive I can be, how much energy I have for
You're
creative.
making me feel like a real slacker, just for the record.
No, I just write fast. I think fast, and it's my full-time job. That's
This
what I
is
do
true. This is
all the
true.
time.
And the way people can contact you is through your website,
Mm-hmm. ArieleSieling.com.
arielsieling.com, and it's Ariel as opposed to Ariel.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Anything else you want to add? You've been very, very generous with your time.
No, this has been great. This is super fun. Thank you for inviting me.
You are entirely welcome, and I look forward to many more conversations with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.